This is not an attempt to ban TikTok. It's an attempt to make TikTok better. Tic-tac-toe, a winner.
They've described the TikTok application as a Trojan horse, but there's some of us who feel that either intentionally or unintentionally, this legislation to ban TikTok is actually a Trojan horse.
When the app GRINDR, a popular LGBTQ app, was acquired by a Chinese company, and the United States government determined that sensitive data of LGBTQ members of the military and U.S. government officials got into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, they required divestment.
Breaking now, the House voted overwhelmingly to pass a bill that could lead to a ban against TikTok. The final tally was 352 to 65. 50 Democrats opposed and 12 Republicans opposed. The legislation now heads to the Senate, but it's unclear if it's going to pass there. Someone who has been at the forefront of this issue is Adam Kovacevic. Now, I've studied his work while on fellowship at the Atlantic Council, while in the Council's China Hub, and I know that Adam is the founder and CEO of the Chamber of Progress. He's worked at the intersection of tech and politics for more than 20 years, previously leading public policy at Google and Line. Adam, is ByteDance's TikTok divestment bill going to pass in the Senate?
Honestly, I think the outlook is somewhat cloudy. We know that Senator Rand Paul is going to object to the bill moving on unanimous consent, and so that really leaves the bill to move under regular order. I also think the bill would clear the 60-vote threshold for a filibuster. But then so really, I see the key question as, do Senate Democrats want Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to bring this bill to the floor? And particularly, I think he's going to listen to the vulnerable Senate Democrats, people like Sherrod Brown and John Tester, Bob Casey. Does voting on this bill, voting for this bill and advancing it, help them in their reelection campaigns? That's often, frankly, the calculus for how the Senate majority decides to use floor time. And to be honest, and I'm somebody who thinks this bill is a good idea, I think it's a little bit unclear as to whether the Senate will take it up.
Well, specifically, it would require for ByteDance, which is the parent company of TikTok, to divest within 6 months. We're still about 8 months away from an election, and there are a lot of members in Congress and at the presidential level, including President Biden, who now has a TikTok account for his reelection effort, who might want to see TikTok off of folks' phones, but maybe wait until after the election. Is that a proper analysis?
Well, I do think that in the background of this debate has been this fear, particularly on the Democratic side, that a lot of voters, particularly younger voters, are using TikTok and they don't want to be held responsible for a ban. Of course, this bill isn't a ban, it's a divestiture, but there's a very real possibility that ByteDance, if faced with a divestiture demand, says, forget it. We don't want to, we're not going to divest or sell TikTok to a U.S. under any circumstances. The mechanism of this bill is novel because it doesn't require the president really to do much of anything. It requires that by default, app stores and ISPs block apps like TikTok unless they are divested. And the president can certify whether it's been a proper divestiture. But beyond that, it's really in the hands of app stores and ISPs to enforce the law. And so that's a novel step that, frankly, was not true of past efforts to deal with this issue. I also note that the bill was drafted in part by Lisa Monaco, who is a senior official at the Department of Justice, in part to I think withstand scrutiny and legal challenges that have faced this bill before. I think it's still unclear how that's going to fare. But that's a new dynamic this time around.
Adam, it's tough for me to hear arguments about freedom of speech and constitutionality of freedom of speech when the app is owned by a communist-backed corporation. Here in the United States, as you know, Adam, there's a separation between the private sector and the government sector. But in communist China, the business community is the Communist Party. And so I guess try to square me that circle. I mean, I know for a lot of folks, it's very perplexing. If MTV was owned by Russia in the 1980s, that wouldn't have been allowed. The FCC would have never allowed that to happen. How did we get here to a point where China is able to use the very rights and freedoms that we all value so much against us?
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. And I also think a little bit about the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when we still had Russia Today, which is was a Russian propaganda network on a lot of U.S. cable channels. And they were allowed to do that legally. There was no law or change that forced them off. But in the aftermath of that invasion, most U.S. cable systems actually removed Russia Today, mostly due to pressure, to public pressure. But I think a lot of people look back and they say, well, wait a minute, we let Russia Today, which was a propaganda channel of the Russian government in the United States for how long? And I sort of suspect that when TikTok is finally sold, or if it results to them having to leave the U.S. because they don't want to be sold, I think some may look back and say, well, wait, why? It's kind of unbelievable that we allowed this to go on for as long as it did.
Well, and in addition to that, if you go into China, you can't go on Instagram. You can't go on Google. Right. You can't go on any of the apps that everybody here loves to use. And by the way, China definitely doesn't have freedom of speech in China. So why is it that it's okay for China not to allow U.S. innovation in their networks, but we somehow are criticized, the United States is criticized when we try to uphold the democratic principles that we all value so much?
Well, you're absolutely right. And I think the reality is that the way that ByteDance has responded to these calls for divestiture sort of raise more questions, right? Because look, if TikTok is just a harmless video app, why does the Chinese government care so much about retaining U.S. ownership, right? And so every objection they make really kind of deepens the sense that China views this app, which, by the way, they don't even allow to operate in China, that it has a strategic national security purpose for China. And so, I just think like that kind of behavior just raises more questions about the sort of, again, national security value that the app has for the Chinese government.
Back in World War II, a common phraseology was that there was an ocean that separated us from the conflict in Europe. But nowadays, that propaganda war is in many ways being played out in our pockets, in our smartphones. How is what's happening with regards to ByteDance and TikTok and the conversation and the policy changes that we're having here in Washington indicative of a larger issue about the battle for stopping the spread of disinformation on the digital frontier?
Well, I mean, absolutely. We know that our foreign enemies, that started with Russia, it's increasingly true of China now, are actively engaged in information warfare and actively trying to sort of sow dissent and sort of highlight dissent in America as a way of advancing their own aims. I think we saw that with Russians and Trump. I think there was actually a new report from the intelligence agencies this week that we have actually seen that kind of thing on TikTok in the past. And so I do think, we want to be eyes open about the potential risks. And I'm one who's actually less concerned about the sort of data privacy risks and is more concerned about the propaganda risks coming from Chinese control. Because again, TikTok being owned by ByteDance, they're subject to Chinese law. Yes, they're going to have to turn over data, but more importantly, they can't do anything content-wise that really crosses the Chinese government's aim. Very little content on Tiananmen Square, very little content on Uyghurs. I mean, it's just, you see this kind of documented in studies of what kind of content is available on TikTok.
I'm old enough to remember when MySpace was a thing, when Napster was a thing. The economy survived when those apps went out of fashion. So I think the kids will be all right. But the final topic that I want to address on this point is it's not just Gen Z that is on TikTok. There is Wall Street that is invested in companies like ByteDance that are rooted financially in companies like ByteDance achieving success so that they can make an investment. What specific policy changes need to be implemented so that U.S. investors, either knowingly or unknowingly, are no longer invested in the success of a communist-backed corporation?
Well, I think you've seen, frankly, the Biden administration take steps to address this issue, right, of sort of inbound, outbound investment in China. But one of the things I find interesting is that, Jeff Yass, who's one of the main U.S. investors in ByteDance, who's been a big opponent of this bill, frankly, all of the U.S. employees of TikTok would be much better off if the company was sold. There is no path for TikTok to become a public company under the current trajectory. They cannot become a public company in the U.S. They're not going to be listed on the Chinese stock exchange. And so being sold to a U.S. owner and then going public is actually a good path. That's exactly what happened with GRINDR, which was owned by the Chinese. CFIUS forced its divestiture. and they ended up going public. So I actually think in the end that the financial markets would be much better served by this company being, U.S. owned and then being a public company on the U.S. markets. But they can't do that while they're owned by ByteDance.
The situation with GRINDR is a good example of how once that went through, that CFIUS deal went through, the U.S.-backed forces were able, the forces in the private sector were able to stand up for democratic principles and human rights that China just doesn't even factor into as it relates to LGBTQIA+ communities. I want to thank you, Adam, so much. I really, really appreciate your analysis and your time today for this incredibly important issue. We'll have you back on to talk more. Happening now, a Georgia judge has dismissed some of the charges against former President Donald Trump. Fulton County Superior Court Judge Scott McAfee dismissed 3 charges against Trump. It's a devastating blow to Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, who is prosecuting the Georgia election interference case. The judge said that Willis and her team did not provide enough evidence. The judge still hasn't made a decision about whether Willis will be disqualified from the case because of her romantic affair with the special prosecutor, Nathan Wade. Joining me now with the latest is The Hill's Kate Martell, author of the 1230 Report. Kate, is this a win for Trump in Georgia, right?
Yeah, totally a win for Trump, Kevin. Any of the 91 pending criminal charges against Trump that can be dropped, this is the first time any of them have been dropped, is a big deal for him. I will say that there are still several charges pending in Georgia, that this doesn't hurt the indictment, that the case will still move forward. But basically, some of these charges they deemed there wasn't enough evidence. They're almost too generic to either prove or defend. But big win for Trump that he has any of his charges pulled away, and that now he can, play into the argument that, this is political witch hunt. There wasn't even enough evidence to prove it, and big win for Trump.
So do you think that the judge is going to let Willis stay on the case? I mean, where are we in the timetable for that development?
Yeah, I think we're going to find out by the end of the week whether or not Willis can stay on the case. No matter what the outcome is at this point, though, she's already hurt public opinion, and there will be political implications whether or not she's on the case or not. I think it is interesting to note, though, that if she is pulled off the case, that another Georgia district attorney will have to be chosen. That's not so easy because, in looking at other counties, you have to find a Georgia district attorney's office that can handle the scope of the investigation, has enough resources, and wants to take it on. And then you look at the case more broadly, and that if you bring in new prosecutors, they can alter the charges, they can drop charges, they can add charges. So it's a big deal for the case. And whether or not they do end up removing Willis from the case, I think it still has these major political implications, and it's already significantly damaged the case.
All right, separately, Trump and Biden, they now are officially their party's nominees. No surprises there. They got the delegates. So all talk is turning to who exactly Trump is going to pick as his running mate. Who do we think he's going to pick?
Yeah, so Tim Scott comes to mind as being the only Senate Black Senate Republican. He dropped out of the race in November and has been campaigning for Trump. He's a strong pick. Congressman Elise Stefanik is a rising star in the Republican Party, and she's also somebody that comes to mind. She happens to be the first member of Congress to actually endorse Trump's presidential run. So she's somebody that comes to mind. Now, Katie Britt is somebody that I had been hearing was
Hold on. Senator Katie Britt is on the short list for Trump?
She's somebody that has been floated. That is a pick for him, but I think last Thursday might have damaged any hopes of that happening because she's been widely mocked after that State of the Union address. Do you think she has a shot, Kevin?
No, I don't, to be honest. And quite honestly, I think there's mocking, and then I also think there's just bad staffing. I mean, to think of that meeting where they just think of the group think, let's put her in a kitchen. I mean, it doesn't resonate. And not just from the obvious glaring criticisms that Republicans have made, that MAGA Republicans have made about that optically, also just disrespectful to have such a large audience after the State of the Union address when we're talking about the commander-in-chief and foreign policy and just very serious issues. It was very, I don't know. It just, I would say that about anyone, by the way. So there was a lot wrong with that. But anyway, I digress. Back to you, Kate.
Yeah, no, it definitely left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. Yeah. So she's somebody I think that is no longer on the list, we're safe to say. But, there's of all these picks that we're talking about, that Trump's short list, we keeps hearing, keeps evolving. Trump campaign advisors have said that that list is growing, and then we hear it's shrinking. And so I think that there's still a lot of names that we still haven't heard from that could very much come up. Former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, he's somebody that's also been floated. But I do believe the campaign, when they say at this point that they have not made their choice and they still have time. So why not let the campaign cycle play out a little bit and see later on in the campaign cycle who might be able to add to the ticket and help in certain states based on polling. So it's still fairly early. My bet is Tim Scott, and we can later play this clip once we know, and you can laugh at me.
Or I can be like, she knew, folks. Kate Martell knew. You know, I remember back in 2016 when all of the reports were who is Trump going to pick. And I remember being in Indiana when Mike Pence was picked and going to the first rally that he gave as Trump's Veep pick. And at that time, the thinking was that Trump needed to solidify the evangelical conservative vote within the Republican Party. What do you think the calculation is for Trump world and for former President Trump himself? What's the specific role that they're looking for the Veep pick to add on to his coalition? Because it's not necessarily evangelicals.
No, that's interesting that you bring that up. I think adding a woman to the ticket would certainly help Trump. He's never done well with suburban women voters. That's an area that I think he would like to pick up. That's something that could help. I think the fact that Senator Tim Scott is, a prominent Black Senate Republican would also help him. That's something I think the ticket that the Trump team would like to look at. More broadly, I just think that there's also specific states that they might be looking at polling and saying that, if we add someone from this particular region, maybe that can help us out.
Yeah, really, really interesting to see how the calculation for Trump world has shifted just over the years, even now as he prepares for 2024. Meanwhile, Trump is not the only person who's got to pick a running mate. RFK Jr. is making some waves about who he is mulling over to select as his running mate. What do we know?
Yeah, RFK has reportedly made his pick and will announce it sometime in the next 2 weeks. He actually has to make his pick sooner because to get on ballots in some states, he was required to have a running mate. So that's why we're going to have this pick, I think, earlier than we would expect from Trump. Some of the names that have been floated are football player Aaron Rodgers or the former Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura. I've heard Senator Rand Paul, Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang. Those are some names that have been floated that I've been hearing.
Senator Paul says he's not going to do it. He said no way. So he's not going to do that. He's going to stick with the Republicans this go around. Aaron Rodgers, what would be the justification? I mean, no offense to the Jets, but they're not exactly known as being good on execution.
Yeah, I know that would really surprise me. I don't follow football that closely, so I'm not even sure what he would really add to it. But it's the name that we keep hearing that I think is one of the top people. That and Jesse Ventura are the two top names that have been floated. Well,
we'll leave it there with that. Meanwhile, back on Capitol Hill, another retirement. Congressman Ken Buck, Colorado Republican, he's leaving Congress next week. I mean, if you're Speaker Mike Johnson, could it be any more complicated now that you've lost another Republican in your shrinking majority? How's this going to impact policy?
My headline in the 12:30 report today is that Mike Johnson's job just got a little bit worse yesterday. They already have such a razor thin majority, and now that has shrunk to just 2 members. And, we're in an election year, so I think that does help in just in the case that you already have very low expectations for what's going to happen legislatively in an election year. That being said, still part of the government hasn't been funded, and there's still controversial measures there. I think the overall takeaway here is that Speaker Johnson's going to have to work with Democrats more, considering he only has a 2-seat majority among Republicans. Either his entire caucus has to be unified. He only has a little bit of leeway, which is really, really hard to happen in this political climate, that he's going to have to compromise and bring some more Democrats on board. So it's probably not great for people on the far right that don't want to compromise with Democrats. And, I think Speaker Johnson just needs to cross his fingers and hope that he can get a government funding bill through without being ousted as Speaker in the next few weeks.
Well said. Kate Martell, author of The Hill's 1230 Report, my favorite newsletter, folks, in Washington, D.C. Go to thehill.com and subscribe to it. Thank you to my friend, Kate Martell. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Kevin.
Problems keep mounting for Alaskan Airlines after a door plug blew out mid-flight in January. That Boeing 737 MAX 9 was allegedly scheduled for maintenance later that same day. Leading up to that emergency, there were reports of issues with that particular plane mounting for days, possibly even weeks. That's according to a new investigation that's now been made public. Engineers, technicians for Alaska Airlines were so concerned they even tried to pull the plane out of service. But the airline chose to keep the jet flying until it ended the day in Portland, where it could be serviced. A preliminary report from the NTSB says that the plug was missing 4 bolts meant to secure the panel. Russian President Vladimir Putin says the West is risking nuclear war should they intervene more directly in Ukraine. Putin also warned that Russia is prepared to use nuclear weapons if its sovereignty and independence were threatened. He made those comments in an interview on Russian state television. Meanwhile, President Biden and the White House announcing a new $300 million weapons package for Ukraine earlier this week. President Biden also said Tuesday that the package wasn't enough and urged Congress to pass additional funding. And it's almost time to celebrate my mom's favorite holiday, St. Patrick's Day. If you've got the luck of the Irish, Savannah, Georgia is rolling out a massive celebration to mark the 200th anniversary of its famed St. Patrick's Day parade. The celebration has become one of the biggest street parties in the South next to Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Remember to wear green or my mother will be disappointed in you. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. My name is Kevin Cirilli. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.